Imagine pouring your life savings into a beautiful mountain Airbnb in North Carolina, only to lose everything in one night to a hurricane. I'm Jeff Hampton, an asset protection attorney and founder of STR Law Guys, and we have helped thousands of short-term rental investors safeguard their legal and financial investments from exactly situations just like this one. In this video, I'm going to break down for you exactly what to do so that you can avoid losing everything because of a hurricane or because of some sort of accident at your property. Wait around to the end of this video and I will share with you a free resource, a checklist for you to work from so that you know your short-term rentals are protected and you don't suffer the same fate as Henry and Helen. Meet Henry and Helen, the proud owners of a stunning Airbnb property in North Carolina. They thought they were protected until a hurricane hit overnight and cost them over $500,000 in damages, and shortly after they heard the devastating words come out of their insurance agent's mouth, claim denied. Their mistake? Relying on their insurance agent telling them they had the right policy, when in reality they had no coverage. A common mistake that happens all too often in the short-term rental industry. Let me tell you the story of Henry and Helen. They had saved up their money. They both worked W-2 jobs. They were doing all they could to get into their very first short-term rental. They finally found a place they loved up in the mountains. It had a great view in North Carolina, and they had put all of their savings into that first purchase, knowing and expecting they were going to receive a cash flow return. They were practically beaming with pride. They knew they had cashed in on the short-term rental gold rush they purchased in 2022, and they were ready to start making the cash flow they expected when they did their research. In fact, they were right. They had an amazing year in 2023, and the first part of their 2024 was looking wonderful. But then they learned a very costly and important lesson when it comes to insurance. Always expect the unexpected and never trust the word of your insurance agent. In October of 2024, the local weather station had issued a hurricane warning. Initially, Helen was a little concerned about it, but then Henry just said, "Hey, look, we're in the mountains of North Carolina. Nothing here to worry about." Helen continued to concern herself over it, and finally Henry said, "Listen, rest assured, worst case scenario, if anything bad happens, our insurance will at least cover us so we can rebuild." Little did they know that the best policy that their agent recommended, in fact, was still just a residential policy. There was no part of their insurance that actually provided commercial coverage. And worst of all, they had no provision for loss of income so that they could cover their carry costs in the event their property had to go off the Airbnb platform, which is exactly what happened when this hurricane hit. As the hurricane approached, Henry and Helen scrambled to prepare their property, lock everything down. But as they waited the storm out, with just extremely high winds and tons of flooding, once they made it back to the property, they then realized that a tree had fallen in on the top of their property, and now their dreams of what they planned to do with this property, they felt, had completely washed away. Weeks later, as time continued to pass by, of course, Henry and Helen, the first thing they cared about is they've got a mortgage that's due. So they reached out to their insurance agent and they said, "Hey, listen, what do we have to do to file a claim to make sure that we receive some type of coverage to pay our mortgage? Because nobody's able to rent this property because there's nobody here and our house is damaged." As the insurance agent flipped through their policy, there was a long pause on the phone, only to hear the insurance agent say, "I'm sorry, Henry, Helen, but it doesn't look like you had loss of income protection or coverage on this policy. I'm sorry, but there will be no recovery to help you pay your mortgage or your expenses while we wait to rebuild." Henry and Helen, of course, were very upset to hear this, but they looked at each other and they remembered they had 6 months of expenses set aside for exactly a situation like this, so they would be okay. But then the next question they asked is, okay, what do we have to do in order to start to rebuild? And how much are we covered for that rebuild? The insurance agent began to dig through the policy and he found out what the estimated cost was for the rebuild. Unfortunately, it was about $450,000 that the property was insured for, but they learned a short time later that it was going to cost over $600,000 to actually do the full rebuild of the property. Now, what did that turn into? an additional $150,000 balance that these poor people were going to have to come up with in order to cover the rebuild of their property. This was going to have to go on top of their mortgage because they did not have good coverage. Finally, the last thing that Henry and Helen asked their insurance agent about is what they needed to do in order to file a claim just for the damages that had taken place here. And as the insurance agent started flipping through their insurance policy, they actually got to the exclusion section of their insurance. And what did they find? Under the exclusion section, it mentioned business or commercial use as an exclusion. Now, of course, Henry and Helen did not understand what the insurance agent was talking about. And there was that long pause again, where then the insurance agent said, "I'm sorry, Henry, Helen, this looks like it was a residential policy only. There is nothing in here that provides for commercial coverage for your Airbnb property." The insurance agent then said, "I'm sorry, Henry, Helen, your claim is denied." This wasn't just a punch in the gut. This was an absolute financial catastrophe, but it could have absolutely been prevented. Grasping at straws, Helen then looked over at Henry and said, "But what about Airbnb insurance? Won't AirCover help us with this?" After a few phone calls to Airbnb, Henry and Helen were then reminded that Airbnb insurance is extremely limited. In fact, it's primarily going to cover any damages that guests may cause and repairs that might be needed, but it certainly did not cover any natural disasters. So as a result of that, they were going to be on their own for the property repairs. Thankfully, Henry and Helen had at least 6 months cash reserves to protect them until they figured out their next move. But I want you to understand, these are lessons that Henry and Helen did not have to learn the hard way. But we can learn from what happened in this situation so that we're not left in financial ruin the next time there's a natural disaster, or maybe even more likely, the next time someone might get hurt on your property and greedy lawyers want to sue you for a premises liability lawsuit. So what are the lessons learned? I'm going to give you 4 tips you need to remember so that you can get your financial house in order before the next major disaster might happen to you, like Henry and Helen. Number 1, commercial insurance coverage is a must. Look, I don't even care if you're renting out your property occasionally, maybe only 90 to 180 days out of the year. I want you to understand you have no other option other than to get commercial insurance coverage. Otherwise, you have no protection at all. Here's the shocking reality. Insurance companies themselves tell us that over 65% of short-term rental owners have the wrong kind of insurance. They are paying for residential policies with no commercial coverage. I know that your agent might push you to that cheaper homeowner's policy, but I want you to understand you're not getting what you paid for. If you're going to spend the money to actually have insurance, which you should, make sure you actually have the coverage and level yourself up to commercial insurance protection. Number 2, premises liability coverage is non-negotiable. A guest can slip, fall, or maybe even worse. And who do you think they're going to sue for negligence? It's going to be you as the property owner 100% of the time. So I don't care if your property is even worth just $150,000. It's not based on the value of your property. You need to always have at least $1 million in premises liability protection coverage so that you don't lose your personal assets in a possible lawsuit for a negligence action. Number 3, check your all-risk dwelling policy. Make sure your actual structure is fully protected. From fires to floods to hurricanes, you want to make sure that if your property has to be rebuilt, that it will cover as much of the rebuild costs as possible. Never assume that Airbnb or VRBO will come to your rescue, because I can promise you they won't. Without the necessary protection of the all-risk dwelling coverage policy, you could be left with a gap in coverage where when it comes time to rebuild, you can end up having to pay an additional amount on top of your mortgage just to get your structure rebuilt again. Number 4, loss of income coverage as part of your commercial insurance will save you thousands in the long run. Think about this. If a guest does something to your property or some major event like a hurricane hits in your area, the amount of time that your property will be off the platforms like Airbnb and VRBO could cost you tens of thousands of dollars. Adding this small portion to your policy of a loss of income protection, this is going to help cover you during that period of time so that you don't face financial ruin. I've seen this situation play out so many times with investors, but all of this could be remedied with the right type of insurance strategy put in place before a major event happens. Henry and Helen, they learned their lesson the hard way, but they reminded us of this important lesson. Always read the fine print in your insurance policy. Never trust what your insurance agent tells you, and get the right coverage before you ever need it. The big takeaway here, insurance is much like a life vest. But the life vest only works if you're wearing it when the boat sinks. If you're renting out your property as an Airbnb, make sure you have the right type of life vest on. Otherwise, you'll go down with the ship. At the end of the day, I love short-term rental investments. I own my own as well. But as much as they're a wonderful investment and passive income opportunity, they're also very susceptible to lawsuits. And all it takes is one hurricane, one tornado, one serious injury at your property, and you can turn a dream into financial ruin. Speaking of protecting yourself, what if we're not talking about a natural disaster like a hurricane? But now, what if you find yourself being surrounded by greedy lawyers wanting to sue you because they claim one of your guests was injured on your property? Check out this next video where I break down how you can keep your assets private and make sure that those greedy lawyers can't get to your properties in a lawsuit. See you over there.